You think danger is loud. It yells, it threatens, it breaks things. But the most dangerous people don't raise their voice. They listen, smile, hug. Sometimes they even love you. Carl Jung warned us, the unconscious is not evil. It's simply unknown. And what remains unknown in others will find its way into you. Through silence, through guilt, through love that costs your soul. This isn't about villains. It's about shadows, living in people you trust. And if you're not aware, you'll carry wounds that aren't even yours. You think you're protecting yourself from the obvious threats, from people who shout, demand, manipulate, from those who show you, clearly and loudly, that they're not safe. But what if I told you, those are not the ones you should fear the most? Carl Jung spent his life warning us. The unconscious governs everything. And the most dangerous people are not the ones who lie to you, they're the ones lying to themselves. See, the true danger wears a soft face. It enters not through violence, but through resonance. It seeps in quietly, disguised as empathy, charm, vulnerability, even love. Sometimes the one unraveling your inner peace doesn't even know they're doing it. And you become the container, the mirror, the savior, not because you chose to be, but because something in your soul was open, and their shadow needed somewhere to live. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what if the transformation is not mutual? What if you keep dissolving while they remain intact? You start to feel tired after certain conversations, drained by interactions you can't explain. You begin shrinking, walking on eggshells, re-editing yourself in real time to avoid conflict, even when no one's asking you to. And then the guilt creeps in. You tell yourself you're being dramatic, too sensitive, maybe even toxic. But here's the truth. Sometimes what you're feeling isn't even yours. It's what's been projected onto you, piece by piece, until you no longer recognize your own reflection. Jung called this psychic infection. It happens when one person's unconscious dominates another's consciousness. Not by force, but by proximity. It's invisible, it's soft, but it's real. And over time, it changes you. You begin to compromise your intuition. You quiet your instincts. You tolerate what hurts, not because you're weak, but because you've been made to believe that protecting your peace is selfish. This is not about blame. It's about awareness. Because the shadow doesn't only live in manipulators or narcissists. It hides behind kindness, behind moral superiority, behind the need to help. And if you don't see it, you'll carry it, as if it's your own. So today, we're not going to talk about obvious toxicity. We're going to uncover the 6 types of people Jung would urge you to be cautious with, not because they are evil, but because they are unaware. And unconsciousness is always hungry for a host. Some of these people may look like friends, lovers, mentors. Some may even look like you. But after this video, you will start to see the invisible, the subtle, the spiritual erosion hiding beneath the surface of good intentions. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Because sometimes protecting your peace starts with naming what's been stealing it. You didn't ask for the role. You just played it, silently, consistently. The listener, the one who stays calm, the one who holds it all together. At first, it felt like love or strength. Being the stable one gave you purpose. It made you feel needed. But over time, it began to cost you something invisible, something sacred. Without noticing, you became the emotional anchor for someone else's chaos. You didn't volunteer to carry their wounds, but they handed them to you anyway. And because you're empathetic, you took them. Not all at once, but slowly, story by story, crisis by crisis, until your shoulders ached with things you could never fix. Carl Jung understood this pattern well. He believed that when we don't integrate our own unconscious material, we unconsciously offload it onto others, especially those strong enough to absorb it. And here's the danger. The stronger you appear, the more likely others will use you as their container. But strength without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And empathy without limits becomes self-abandonment. You start to notice that after every conversation, you feel drained. Not just emotionally, spiritually, like pieces of your identity are being chipped away by the weight of someone else's survival. You become their therapist, their diary, their emotional trash can. And at some point, you confuse this dynamic with loyalty. You start to believe that being there for someone means disappearing for yourself. But what you don't see is the slow erosion of your center. Your joy feels muted. Your thoughts feel clouded. You begin to second-guess your feelings because you're constantly prioritizing theirs. Jung warned us of this exact distortion. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote that people often externalize their psychic struggles, seeking someone else to hold what they cannot face. If you're not careful, you become that someone. And what's worse, you start to feel guilty for wanting space. You hesitate to set boundaries because you've been conditioned to see your silence as love. But silence, in this case, is not love. It's erasure. It's what happens when the strong one finally breaks, not with a bang, but with a quiet loss of self. This isn't just psychological. Neuroscience backs it too. Chronic emotional labor rewires your stress response. You live in a subtle state of fight or flight, not because of overt trauma, but because you're carrying someone else's. Your body begins to speak what your mouth won't. Fatigue, tension, insomnia. Your dreams become heavy, and your laughter feels more like muscle memory than joy. You don't cry anymore, not because you're healed, but because you're numb. This is what happens when the role of the strong one becomes your identity. You become the place where other people dump their darkness and never once ask if you're drowning in your own. So here's the question Jung would want you to ask. Who are you when you're not fixing, holding, managing, absorbing? Who are you when you're not performing strength? Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is drop the weight that was never yours to carry. And in doing so, finally remember what your own voice sounds like. Unburdened, undiluted, real. They don't scream. They don't insult you. They don't try to control your life through threats. In fact, they think they're helping. That's what makes them so hard to identify and so dangerous. These are the people who believe they're saving you. They carry an air of sincerity, concern, compassion, but under the surface, their help is not help at all. It's a projection, a coded message from their unconscious. Fixing you will fix something inside me. Carl Jung wrote extensively about this. Projection, he said, is not a sin. It's a psychological necessity. We all do it. The problem isn't the projection itself. The problem is when it's unconscious. Because what's unconscious gets disguised as truth. You might hear it in the advice they give you. You shouldn't be with someone like that. You need to work on your issues. You've always been too sensitive. It sounds reasonable, thoughtful, sometimes even wise, but there's a pressure behind it, an emotional charge that doesn't belong to you. That charge is their shadow. What they can't face in themselves, they try to fix in you. And because you're open, introspective, perhaps even wounded, you listen. You take it in. You try to improve. But slowly, something begins to feel off. You realize their help always comes with a subtle sense of superiority. You're always the one who's broken, needing guidance, needing rescue, and you begin to wonder, am I on a healing journey? Or am I being reshaped into a version of me that fits their unresolved pain? Jung believed that the shadow seeks a host, and the more empathetic you are, the more likely you'll be chosen. In Psychological Types, he warned that unexamined emotions often slip into our relationships, masquerading as care. And here's the paradox. The person projecting on you isn't malicious. They may be a parent, a partner, a friend. They genuinely want to help, but they're not helping you. They're helping the wounded part of themselves they've refused to meet. They look at your sadness and see their own helplessness. They look at your ambition and see their failure. They look at your vulnerability and feel ashamed of their own. And instead of facing those emotions, they offer advice. They overreach. They intervene. Not because you need it, but because they do. And if you don't realize it, you'll spend years living under their psychological weather system, trying to please them, prove to them, heal for them, until you forget that your path was never theirs to walk. This is why Jung emphasized individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, separate from what others project onto you. If you don't individuate, you become a character in someone else's healing fantasy, a symbol, not a soul. So the next time someone tries to fix you, ask yourself, does this come from love or from fear disguised as guidance? Is this feedback or a mirror they're holding up, trying to clean their own reflection? Not every savior wants to save you. Some only want to save the version of themselves they couldn't love. And you are not obligated to carry that weight. It doesn't begin with a fight. It begins with a pause, a hesitation in your voice, a slight adjustment in your posture. You hold your breath not because you're afraid of violence, but because you're afraid of discomfort. You start to notice patterns. When they enter the room, your body contracts. When they're upset, you vanish not physically but emotionally. You silence your truth in real time. And the worst part is, you think you're being mature. You tell yourself, it's not worth it. Let me just keep the peace. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. But here's the quiet truth. You've built a prison and you're calling it emotional intelligence. Carl Jung saw this as a tragedy of the soul. When we abandon our inner voice for the comfort of others, we disconnect from our own psychic reality. Over time, that disconnection becomes a personality. Not who you are, but who you've learned to be in order to survive. This isn't weakness. It's often the result of early emotional conditioning, growing up in environments where love was conditional, where your safety depended on how well you could read moods, anticipate reactions, and adapt your energy to avoid conflict. Psychologists call it the fawn response, a trauma adaptation where you become hyper-attuned to others at the cost of yourself. You become peacekeeping at all costs, but peace that costs your authenticity isn't peace. It's quiet servitude. And the people who benefit from this dynamic, they rarely notice, because your shrinking is invisible. You're just easygoing, low maintenance, so emotionally grounded. But grounded in what? Not truth, not sovereignty, just the learned habit of disappearing. Jung believed that true freedom comes not from comfort, but from confrontation, from facing our fears, our truths, and yes, our discomforts. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he warned that adapting too much to others leads to a false self, a mask we mistake for identity. And that mask, it becomes so natural you forget you're wearing it. You start apologizing for being too much, too emotional, too ambitious, too intense. You laugh off things that hurt. You smile when you want to scream. You call it empathy, but it's really a form of self-erasure. And slowly, day by day, you lose access to your own truth. Philosophically, this is existential surrender. You are no longer living as a subject. You've become an object, orbiting around someone else's emotional gravity. And here's the paradox. They may never ask you to do this, but your body, conditioned by past wounds, does it anyway. Not for them, but against you. The result? Resentment, numbness, disorientation. A life where you're always watching yourself from the outside, trying to manage how you're perceived rather than how you feel. Jung would ask, who are you when you stop apologizing for your own clarity? What truths would rise if you stopped editing yourself in real time? Because sometimes silence is not maturity, it's fear. And the moment you speak, not in anger, but in truth, the walls begin to crack. Not to destroy, but to liberate. You don't owe anyone your smallness. They seem perfect, polished, thoughtful, composed. The kind of person who always knows the right thing to say, the right time to say it, and the right facial expression to match. They are elegant in their control, graceful under pressure, admired by many and exhausted inside. Because behind that performance is not peace, it's suppression. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the demands of society. And for a while it works. The world rewards composure, praises consistency, even if it comes at the cost of authenticity. But the stronger the persona, the more dangerous the shadow hiding behind it. These people aren't liars. They're not trying to deceive you, but they've become so identified with their mask that they've forgotten who they are without it. And when someone forgets themselves, They begin to use others as mirrors, not to reflect who they are, but who they want to be. That's where you come in. They make you their safe person. Not in the real sense, not someone they can be vulnerable with, but someone they expect to keep the illusion intact. You feel it in the subtle expectations. Don't get too emotional. Don't rock the boat. Don't show too much mess. Because anything raw threatens the persona. And anything that threatens the persona activates the shadow. You begin performing without realizing it. You match their energy. You clean up your language. You stay in line. Not out of fear, but out of unconscious compliance. You don't want to disappoint the person who has it all together. But inside, you feel something missing. Depth, spontaneity, truth. Jung warned that over-identification with the persona leads to a kind of soul starvation. In the relations between the ego and the unconscious, he writes, "The persona is what one is not, but what oneself and others think one is." It's not that the persona is evil, it's necessary. We all wear masks. The problem is when we become convinced the mask is the face. And in relationships, this creates a dangerous game. One person performs, and the other becomes an unpaid actor in their emotional theater. You begin to filter your truth. You share less, feel less, until eventually you don't recognize who you are when you're around them. What's worse, when cracks appear in their performance, when they break, rage, or collapse, it feels explosive, because all that repression doesn't disappear. It ferments, and you're the one closest when it leaks. So you clean up the mess, reassure, smooth things over, and the cycle continues. You're not just coexisting, you're protecting their illusion and losing yourself in the process. Jung would ask you, what role are you playing in someone else's drama? Are you being loved for who you are, or for how well you cooperate with their image? Because behind every perfect persona is a deeply hungry shadow. And if you're not conscious, you'll be the one feeding it. Sometimes, love means stepping out of the script. Not to attack, but to return to your own voice. Because you weren't born to be a supporting character in someone else's performance. They said you were too intense, too emotional, too reactive. They said, you take things too personally, or you're always so dramatic. And maybe for a while you believed them. You started doubting your emotional responses. You softened your tone. You made yourself smaller. You began editing your truth not to be polite, but to avoid becoming the target again. But here's the truth Jung spent his life trying to show us. When someone cannot face their own darkness, they need to put it somewhere. And often they put it on you. You become the projection screen for everything they can't confront. Their shame, their anger, their grief, their own intensity becomes unbearable. So they accuse you of being too much. Carl Jung called this the shadow projection. In Aion, he writes, "The shadow is everything about ourselves we do not know or do not want to know. And when we don't want to know it, we see it everywhere else. We find it in our partners, our children, our coworkers, our friends. We project our own inner chaos onto the nearest person willing to hold it. And that's the trap. You, being empathetic, open, perhaps a little sensitive, absorb it. Not because you're weak, but because you care. You think, maybe I am too much. Maybe I should tone it down. And just like that, you enter their story not as yourself, but as a symbol. You're no longer a person in their eyes. You've become a trigger, a scapegoat, a walking reminder of the things they've buried. And what's terrifying is that they don't even know they're doing it. Projection is not a choice. It's an unconscious act. And that's what makes it so dangerous. You start to carry emotions that aren't yours. You feel guilt you didn't earn. You apologize for reactions that were entirely human, but made them uncomfortable. Over time, you forget what your real emotional baseline feels like. You begin asking questions like, am I too sensitive? Did I overreact? Was it really my fault? This is how the erosion happens, not through shouting, but through quiet, persistent doubt. Jung warned that this kind of projection is a theft of soul. When someone offloads their unconscious material onto you, it hijacks your identity. You become who they need you to be, the problem, the disappointment, the enemy, anything but yourself. And here's the paradox. You think you're in conflict with them, But what you're really fighting is their unowned shadow, and that's a battle you can never win, because it's not you they're reacting to. It's a ghost, and you've just been cast to play its role. So the question becomes, are you living as yourself or as someone else's unfinished story? Because until you step out of their projection, you will always be editing your soul to make their psyche feel safe. Jung believed that individuation, becoming your full, authentic self, begins when you stop carrying the unconscious of others. It begins when you name what's being done, when you step out of the symbolic role you've been assigned. Because you are not too much. You were simply standing too close to someone who's never met themselves. Not every wound bleeds. Some wounds drain, slowly, silently, through conversations that leave you empty, through relationships that demand everything but never name it, through people who don't scream or hit or betray, but simply ask you to disappear a little every day. Carl Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Fate is not always loud. Sometimes, fate is a familiar silence, a role you've always played, the strong one, the fixer, the mirror, the problem, all of them scripts you never wrote, but kept performing because someone else's unconscious needed a stage. But here's what Jung understood better than almost anyone. The real danger isn't what others do to you. It's what they make you do to yourself. When you internalize someone's chaos, when you carry someone's shame, when you start shrinking just to make others comfortable, you lose not only your voice, but your center. And without your center, everything feels like a threat. So you adapt, you mold, you absorb, you become the psychic sponge, soaking in pain that isn't yours, trauma that isn't yours, guilt that was never yours to hold. But just because someone is unconscious of their darkness doesn't mean you have to hold it for them. And this is the quiet revolution Jung called us to step back, to observe, to see clearly, because healing doesn't always begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with distance, with naming what has been unnamed, with choosing your reality over someone else's projection. It's not about blame. It's about boundaries, the kind that no one else can see, but you feel when they've been crossed. And if you've recognized yourself in any of these roles, the strong one, the screen, the absorber, know this: you are not broken. You were just chosen by unconscious people to carry what they refused to feel. But now you see it, and that vision is the first step toward freedom. So let me ask you one last thing, and answer it not with your mind, but with your body. Where in your life do you feel most tired? In a way that rest cannot fix. That's where the boundary needs to go. What we explored today is just a fragment, a single thread in the vast tapestry of who we are. But if it made you pause even for a second, then that silence was worth more than 1,000 scrolls. If you're still here, I see you, and I thank you. You're invited to continue with a comment, a click, or even just a thought you carry into your evening. There are more videos waiting, deeper questions, harder truths. I'll be there. Subscribe only if it feels honest. This channel isn't here to chase numbers. It's here to build conversations that matter. Until next time, don't just protect your peace, honor it. And remember, not all danger is loud. Sometimes it's wearing a smile,